Tonight, we're drifting back into a world where survival wasn't something you hoped for. It was something you fought for with every breath, every step, every heartbeat. A world where hunger waited at the door, where sickness crept through the cracks, and where the people at the bottom of society carried the weight of everyone above them. Not knights, not kings, but peasants, the silent millions who held medieval Europe together with calloused hands and relentless endurance. Tonight, we step into their reality, a place where survival was an art, a strategy, and sometimes a miracle. If this kind of storytelling brings you inner peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where in the world are you listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always strangely comforting to know who else is out there closing their eyes to the same story. So settle in. Let the world grow quiet and let's dream together for a while. Welcome to the 13th century, a world of muddy roads, smoky hearths, wooden cottages, and fields stretching under a pale sky. The air smells of damp earth and burning peat. You can hear the low murmur of cattle, the creak of wagons, distant church bells echoing through morning fog. This is medieval Europe, where more than 90% of the population lived, not in castles, but in villages built from wood, thatch, and hope that barely held together. Walk down the narrow lane and feel how close the homes are, walls leaning, roofs sagging, smoke slipping out through holes instead of chimneys. Inside each cottage, families crowd around a single hearth. The floor is dirt, the air is thick with soot. Chickens scratch in the straw by the doorway. A pot of thin broth simmers because it's all they have. Step into their day and you feel the weight immediately. No clocks, no breaks, no room for weakness. Every sunrise starts a race, beating the frost, chasing the harvest, outlasting sickness, and praying the Lord doesn't demand more than the fields can give. Children haul water before they can write their names. Mothers ration bread with hands that shake. Fathers scan the sky, terrified of storms that could destroy months of work in a single afternoon. Life at the bottom of the pyramid is a constant negotiation with forces far bigger than any one person. The plague that wipes out whole families, the famine that empties every sack, the Lord whose dews rise even as crops fail. But peasants aren't passive victims in this story. They adapt, they cooperate. They whisper strategies passed down through generations. They bury their dead, mourn, rebuild, always rebuild, because survival is what their world demands most fiercely. So step into this era with open eyes. Smell the smoke, feel the hunger. Hear the quiet strength in the way they work, love, endure, and hope despite everything pressing against them. This is not the story of castles or kings. It's the story of the people who carried their kingdoms on tired shoulders and somehow kept going. When you picture medieval Europe, you might imagine grand castles, armoured knights, bustling markets, and kings seated on gilded thrones. But that world, the one carved into storybooks and movies, belonged to a tiny slice of society. Everyone else lived somewhere very different. At the bottom of the pyramid, in the mud, in the smoke, in the ache of endless labour and the uncertainty of every new day. From the 9th to the 15th century, Europe was a place where the most fragile part of your life was simply being alive. Survival wasn't gentle. It wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't something you assumed would happen tomorrow just because it happened yesterday. It was something fought for, fiercely, quietly, relentlessly, by the people most overlooked by history, medieval peasants. Imagine standing in a small village at dawn. The sky is grey and thin. The fields outside the settlement are wet with dew, or frost, or sometimes both. Smoke curls from thatched roofs, drifting low because chimneys are luxuries peasants don't have. The dirt road beneath your feet is uneven, patched with puddles, scattered with footprints from neighbours who began working hours before you woke. Inside the cottages, life begins without ceremony. A mother shakes a child awake so they can carry water from the stream. A father sharpens a tool by firelight before stepping out to the fields. Grandparents, too frail to work outside, prepare the first meal, often nothing more than coarse bread and weak ale. And all the while, everyone shares a quiet knowledge. They are one storm, one sickness, one bad harvest away from disaster. Peasants lived at the mercy of three unstoppable forces: plagues, famines, and lords. Each one could ruin an entire village. Together they shaped the rhythm of medieval life into something almost unbearably fragile. First, the plagues. Disease didn't knock on the door politely. It seeped into homes through fleas, through animals, through water, through a neighbour's cough. Fevers swept across villages so fast that people sometimes went to bed healthy and didn't wake up. The Black Death is the most famous, but it wasn't unique. Dysentery, smallpox, typhus. These were constant visitors. A single outbreak could erase a generation. Then came the famines. Medieval Europe's food system balanced on a knife's edge. Too much rain, too little rain. One cold summer, one swarm of pests, and crops failed. Grain stores shrank dangerously. Bread became thinner, darker, harder. People survived on whatever they could find. Weeds, acorns, tree bark soaked and ground into famine flour. Hunger changed the shape of their bodies, hollowing faces, darkening eyes, slowing movement. But the most persistent threat wasn't disease or hunger. It was the lords, the men who owned the land and controlled nearly every aspect of peasant life. Lords demanded rent in crops, labour, livestock, or coins peasants didn't have. Even during shortages, dues rarely decreased. Wheat might be failing, children might be starving, but the manor still expected its portion. A peasant could survive a poor harvest, but not a poor harvest and a demanding lord. And yet, peasants endured. Not through luck, but through strategy. Not through strength, but through community. Not through privilege, but through stubborn resilience carved into their bones by centuries of hardship. Survival meant working together. Neighbours shared tools because owning them individually was impossible. Whole villages gathered to repair roofs, build fences, plough fields. When one family's grain ran out, others rationed theirs so no one died. People whispered weather signs, passed down herbal knowledge, taught children when to plant, how to forage, where to find mushrooms after rain. Survival meant adapting. When famine hit, peasants found food in forests, marshes and riverbanks. When plague spread, they shut doors, burned bedding, moved livestock, or fled to the countryside to escape crowded homes. When lords demanded more than they could give, peasants hid grain, lied about yields, or banded together to resist quietly, because obedience alone wasn't enough to live. Survival meant enduring. The winters were long, the summers were brutal. The world itself felt unpredictable, as though the soil, sky, and sickness all conspired to keep life difficult. But peasants persisted season after season, building families, tending land, preserving traditions, and shaping Europe far more than kings ever could. While the top of the pyramid crumbled under its own excess, the bottom held. Peasants fed kingdoms. Peasants rebuilt after disasters. Peasants carried the weight of the world, silently, invisibly, generation after generation. This is the world of medieval peasants, a world where survival was an art, and every day began with uncertainty and ended with gratitude for simply making it to dusk. Step into a peasant's morning, and you're stepping into a life already half spent before the sun even rises. There is no such thing as waking up, because most peasants never fall into a full, deep sleep. They drift in and out of rest, pulled awake by coughing children, crying livestock, cold draughts, or the ache in their bodies that never truly fades. When dawn finally comes, it isn't gentle. It's a reminder that work has already begun. The cottage is dim, lit only by the orange glow of embers barely holding on to life in the hearth. Someone blows softly, coaxing flame back into being. The smoke gathers low because there's no chimney. It clings to clothes, hair, lungs. A thin pot of porridge reheats, and everyone gets a few spoonfuls. Not enough to feel full. Just enough to begin another day. Outside, the air is cold even in summer. Morning mist hangs heavy over the fields. Dew grips the grass like frost. You feel that first breath chill your chest. Then the work begins. For peasants, every day is a gamble. A wager against nature, sickness, and authority. They plant, weed, harvest, repair, haul, build, and repeat, knowing that failure in any season could mean hunger by winter. Nothing about their routine is simple. Nothing is guaranteed. Fieldwork starts the moment the light is strong enough to see. Men and women bend low over the earth, backs curved like bows. The soil is heavy with moisture, clumping around fingers and tools. The repetitive motions, digging, lifting, sewing, cutting, carve pain into shoulders and knees. You can hear the soft grunts of effort, the scrape of metal against dirt, the occasional whispered curse when a tool breaks or a stone blunts the blade. Children work too, long before their bodies are ready. Some chase birds away from crops, waving rags. Some gather firewood, hauling loads too big for their size. Others help tend animals, cows, sheep, pigs, feeding, milking, cleaning, guiding them to pasture and back. Childhood is measured not in play, but in chores. And all the while a question hangs in the air. Will this be enough? Because everything a peasant does lives under threat. A sudden rainstorm can flatten wheat. A week of heat can kill it. Frost can grip the ground in mid-spring, destroying months of work in one night. Too much sun, too little sun, too much rain, too little rain. Nature rarely cooperates. And if the crops fail, there is no savings to fall back on, no pantry full of food, no market where prices drop out of pity. A bad harvest means hunger. A very bad one means starvation. Even in years when crops grow well, fear doesn't disappear. Because every peasant owes dues, taxes, labour, rent, to the local lord. And the lord's demands don't change just because the weather is cruel. In fact, sometimes they grow. A lord might visit with stewards and scribes, measuring grain stores, demanding more than families can spare. The manor court punishes anyone who protests. You can feel the tension ripple through the village those days. Mothers hide food under floorboards. Men whisper in barns about how much grain to declare. Children grow quiet sensing danger without understanding the politics behind it. Then there's the fear of sickness, a constant, invisible menace. A single fever can sweep through the cottage. A cough can turn deadly. People don't know why diseases strike, only that they do, and often without mercy. A farmer strong enough to work fields for 16 hours a day can fall to illness in a week. And if a worker falls, the whole family stumbles. One fewer set of hands. One fewer body gathering crops. One fewer chance of surviving the next season. Even the rhythm of a good day carries exhaustion woven into every movement. Peasants return home after dusk, clothes stiff with sweat and dirt. They eat whatever is left. Broth, bread, maybe cheese if they're lucky. Every muscle aches, their hands throb, their legs tremble. But there's no rest. Tools must be repaired. Animals must be checked. Children must be fed. The fire must be maintained. Clothes must be mended. And tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that, and the month after that. Life for medieval peasants wasn't defined by big events. It was defined by the weight of small, endless struggles. A broken plough, a sick cow, a spoiled sack of grain, a tax collector's knock, a storm forming on the horizon. Every day they balanced on the edge of uncertainty, working with everything they had just to keep from falling. And the miracle isn't that some survived, it's that most did. Day after day, generation after generation. Famine wasn't a rare crisis in medieval Europe. It was a recurring visitor, returning often enough that every peasant lived with the fear of it tucked somewhere deep in their bones. Hunger didn't appear with warning or mercy. It crept in slowly the way winter lengthened shadows, and by the time people realized what was happening, the fields were already failing, the grain sacks already thinning, and hopes were already slipping. To understand how peasants survived famine, you first need to understand how fragile their food system really was. Nearly everything depended on grain. Wheat, if you were lucky, barley or rye if you weren't. Bread was the heart of every meal. It filled bellies, fueled labour, and held communities together. When grain was plentiful, life felt manageable. When it wasn't, everything fell apart. A single season could unravel everything. A cold snap in spring, a summer of relentless rain, a swarm of locusts, a fungal disease turning crops black, or the early winters of the Little Ice Age whispering their way across Europe. Any one of these could turn a promising harvest into a catastrophe. And when fields failed, the consequences stretched far beyond hunger. They shook the stability of entire villages. At first, peasants tightened belts. Meals became smaller, bread slices thinner, stews stretched with water. A family might quietly skip supper so children could eat more in the morning. But as weeks passed, the adjustments grew desperate. They turned to famine foods, the things no one touched unless there was no choice. Acorns soaked to remove bitterness, nettles boiled into a thin soup, tree bark ground into powder and mixed with flour, wild garlic, mushrooms, weeds, anything that could be swallowed. Bread changed too. It became darker, denser, mixed with whatever filler people could find, crushed beans, ground oats, even powdered tree roots. This was famine bread, something so hard and bitter that some described it as barely edible. But it kept people alive. Adults grew thin, their faces sharp with exhaustion. Children's ribs showed beneath shirts. Legs trembled during work. People grew light-headed, then sluggish, then feverish, walking through each day with a hollow ache that never left the stomach. But peasants were not helpless. They had systems, quiet, communal strategies honed through centuries of experience. Many villages built communal granaries, storing emergency grain for the entire settlement. These weren't generous institutions. They were necessary survival machines. Stewardship was strict, rationing even stricter. Grain was measured out to families in careful portions designed to stretch through the worst seasons. There were rationing traditions too, unwritten but deeply respected. Families ate only one full meal a day, sometimes less. Children received the first share. Elders often took the smallest portion or none at all to ensure the young survived. And when grain ran dangerously low, foraging became a collective effort. Entire groups moved into forests and fields, women searching for roots and berries, men climbing trees for nuts, children gathering sorrel, wild mustard, or dandelion leaves along the edges of paths. Famine created hunger, but it also created unity. Neighbours shared food, even when they had little to give. Families cooked together. People whispered news of where edible plants still grew. If someone discovered a patch of wild onions, they didn't hoard, they told the village. Because in famine, survival wasn't individual. It was communal. Yet the hardest part of famine was psychological. Hunger gnawed not just at the stomach, but at the mind. People woke each morning with dread, knowing the day would bring the same empty ache. Mothers watched children weaken. Fathers feared telling their families there would be no supper. The smallest setbacks, a spilled basket of grain, a spoiled loaf, could break spirits. But peasants learned how to endure. Experience taught them which herbs eased hunger pains. Stories passed down taught which plants were safe and which were fatal. Songs were sung during work to maintain rhythm, even when muscles trembled. Groups gathered at night, sharing warmth and scraps of food, telling tales of years when famine had passed and better seasons returned. And eventually, famine did pass. It always did. The rains returned, fields greened again, grain sprouted. Children laughed with energy they hadn't felt in months. Families baked real bread, soft, warm, thick, and the smell alone brought tears. But famine left marks. On the land, on the bodies that endured it, on the memories of those who survived, and on the culture that learned to prepare for the next one. Peasants survived the famine years, not because life was kind, but because they understood something essential. Hunger could break individuals, but it could not break a village that held itself together. Imagine living in a world where death has no footsteps, no warning, no sound, no shape you can recognize. Just a cough in the next room, a fever in a child, a sudden chill running down someone's spine. In medieval Europe, disease didn't arrive like an enemy you could see. It seeped into villages silently, invisibly, and without the slightest hesitation. For peasants already living on the edge, plague was the sharp push that sent entire communities into collapse. Hunger you could fight, lords you could avoid, weather you could endure. But sickness could sweep through a village faster than a rumour, and far more deadly. Start with the worst of them all, the Black Death. When it arrived in the 14th century, it moved like a shadow across Europe, swallowing towns and villages in days. It rode on fleas, on rats, on grain sacks, on merchant ships. It slipped under doors, clung to clothing, hid in corners. Some villages lost half their people within a single week. Others vanished entirely, fields left to the wind, because no one was alive to plough them. The symptoms were pure terror. A fever that spiked suddenly. Vomiting that wouldn't stop. Black swellings, buboes rising in armpits and groins, swollen to the size of eggs. The skin darkened. The breath grew foul. And in many cases death came within days. Yet the Black Death was only one killer in a long parade of them. Dysentery, the bloody flux, ripped through villages, especially in summer. A single drink of dirty water could kill a child within days. Diarrhea drained strength until the body simply gave up. Smallpox spread through touch and breath, leaving the living scarred and the young dead. Typhus stalked crowded cottages, carried by lice that thrived in the unwashed layers of clothing peasants could not afford to change. Peasants lived packed together in one-room homes. Animals wandered inside during storms. Water sources were shared with livestock. Waste flowed into ditches near drinking spots. No one understood germ theory. No one knew how disease actually travelled. They only knew this. When someone got sick, everyone else was already in danger. Fear spread as fast as the illness. When a fever struck, people whispered prayers urgently. When a child coughed, mothers froze. When a neighbour fell ill, villagers watched doorways with dread in their eyes. Superstition stepped in where science did not exist. Some believed plagues were punishments for sin, God's anger sweeping across the land. Others blamed spirits, bad air, or curses cast by angry neighbours. Some pointed fingers at strangers or the poorest families. Charms hung over doors. Dried herbs, twisted twigs, carved tokens. People lit fires inside homes to purify the air, filling the rooms with smoke so thick children hid their faces in their sleeves. Villagers prayed to plague saints, touched shrines, carried amulets, begged the heavens for mercy. And still, death came. Yet, strangely, peasants were often quicker to adapt than nobles. They couldn't afford denial. They reacted fast because survival demanded it. When sickness struck, families isolated homes, villagers avoided gatherings, people refused to enter cottages where someone had died. Some communities abandoned entire houses, leaving them to decay rather than risk infection. Worse than the sickness itself were the losses that followed. Farm work stopped. Food production halted. Children lost parents. Parents lost children. Villages lost their healers, their elders, their strongest labourers. Burials became hurried and heartbreaking. Mass graves swallowed generations together. Bodies were wrapped in whatever cloth was available. Old tunics, blankets, sacks, before being lowered into the earth. Priests performed rushed rites, or sometimes none at all when churches overflowed. Yet through the horror, peasants learned the cruel rhythm of plague years. They shared what little they knew about symptoms. They purified water with boiling stones. They moved livestock away from living quarters. They cleaned tools, burned bedding, scrubbed wooden floors. They carried wisdom from one outbreak to the next, desperate to give their families even a sliver of advantage. Peasants died in terrifying numbers, but they also survived in ways history rarely acknowledges. They endured because they adapted, because they supported one another, because they recognized that disease wasn't just a physical threat, it was a psychological one too. In a world ruled by invisible enemies, peasants fought back with instinct, tradition, community, and an unbreakable will to live. When sickness swept through a medieval village, peasants didn't have doctors in white coats, laboratories, or textbooks. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They had no microscopes, no antibiotics, no sterilisation. But they had something just as important: observation, memory, instinct, and traditions shaped by centuries of survival. To understand how peasants fought disease, imagine stepping into a small cottage where someone has just fallen ill. The air is tense. People exchange worried glances. They don't know what the sickness is, but they've seen its shadow before. And they've learned, painfully, what must be done. The first tactic was simple but life-saving: isolation. If someone showed symptoms, they were often moved to one corner of the house, or to a small structure outside. A shed, a storage hut, even a livestock shelter, cleaned just enough to become a sick room. Entire households sometimes barred their doors, shutting themselves in for weeks. It wasn't scientific quarantine, but it worked well enough to slow the spread. Livestock played a role too. Animals were moved away from sleeping areas, especially during outbreaks of fleas or lice, which peasants intuitively recognised made illnesses worse. Beds were shaken out, straw replaced, and thatched roofs checked for infestations. They didn't know the word vector, but they understood that pests brought danger. Then came herbal knowledge, the closest thing peasants had to medicine. Every village had a wise woman, midwife, or herb keeper who understood which plants soothed fevers, which stopped bleeding, which helped with coughs. These women weren't educated by universities. Their knowledge was passed down hand to hand, story to story, generation to generation. And sometimes they were more effective than learned physicians. They used garlic for infections, honey for wounds, vinegar as a disinfectant, alcohol to cleanse cuts, mint to calm stomachs, yarrow to stop bleeding, elderflower to break fevers. When disease struck, these remedies were prepared with ritual precision: herbs crushed with stones, teas brewed in clay pots, poultices spread onto cloth, tinctures dripped under the tongue. The cottage would fill with scents: sharp garlic, sweet honey, bitter roots, pungent smoke. Speaking of smoke, peasants believed strongly in fumigation. They burned herbs like rosemary, juniper, or sage inside homes, choking the air with thick clouds to drive out sickness. It wasn't comfortable. Smoke stung the eyes, burned throats, made children cough. But it cleared fleas, disinfected air, and at times saved lives. They also used fire as purification. Clothes were boiled, bedding was burned, tools were heated in flame, homes were scrubbed with ash and water. Villagers didn't know why these things helped, just that, over time, they had learned they did. Peasants also relied on water wisdom. They drew from cleaner wells, avoided stagnant ponds, boiled water with hot stones during outbreaks. They recognised patterns. Dirty water led to sickness, clean water healed. It was simple but powerful knowledge that kept many alive. And then there were traditional healers who mixed medicine with ceremony. Some whispered prayers while applying salves. Some tied charms around wrists or beds. Some used chants passed down from ancestors. These rituals offered comfort, and in a world where fear itself weakened the body, comfort was a kind of medicine. But perhaps the most important tool peasants had was experience. Every outbreak taught something: which symptoms meant danger, which herbs worked, which homes survived, which mistakes cost lives. In a time without written records, this information spread through stories told around the hearth, warnings and wisdom passed from old to young, from neighbour to neighbour. Mothers taught daughters how to ease a fever. Fathers showed sons how to identify poisonous plants. Midwives carried entire worlds of knowledge in their memories. These weren't guesses. These were survival strategies refined across generations. And while many still died, many also lived because peasants refused to give up. They kept experimenting, learning, adapting. They treated disease like an enemy they could not see, but could outsmart. In the end, peasants survived, not because they understood sickness, but because they understood life, its patterns, its dangers, its signals. They trusted the earth. They trusted each other. They trusted the wisdom etched into their traditions. And against all odds, without science, without doctors, without tools, they fought disease with everything they had, and often won. If famine and disease were the natural enemies of peasants, lords were the human ones. Impossible to escape, impossible to ignore, and impossible to satisfy. For peasants, the greatest source of daily pressure didn't always come from the sky or the soil. It came from the manor on the hill, from the man who claimed ownership of the land beneath their feet, the crops they planted, and often the lives they lived. Life under feudalism meant one truth. A peasant didn't own their home, or their field, or even the crops they harvested. Everything belonged to the lord. Peasants were allowed to live and work on the land, but only if they paid for that privilege. And payment came in every form imaginable. Start with the rents. A peasant owed part of their harvest to the lord every year. Wheat, barley, oats, whatever grew, the lord wanted a portion first. If the harvest was good, the lord took plenty. If the harvest was poor, the lord still took plenty. Hunger didn't reduce obligations. Weather didn't soften expectations. Even death in the family didn't pause dues. Then came the labour services, known as corvée. A peasant couldn't spend every day working for their own family. Several days a week, they had to work the lord's fields instead, ploughing, sowing, building, repairing, hauling wood, tending animals. You could see the bitterness in their eyes as they worked land that wasn't theirs, knowing that every hour spent on the manor meant fewer hours tending to their own survival. Next were the tithes, payments to the church. 10% of everything a peasant produced, 10% of grain, 10% of eggs, wool, honey, 10% of hope, paid not in coins, which peasants barely had, but in goods they desperately needed for winter. And if they failed to deliver, the church had its own courts, its own punishments, its own ways of reminding peasants that even God needed payment. On top of those there were fines. Yes, fines. For using the Lord's mill, for baking bread in the Lord's oven, for grazing animals in the Lord's pasture, for marrying someone from another estate, for inheriting land, for moving away, for staying. A peasant could be fined for almost anything, and if they couldn't pay, the debt carried interest or took the form of more forced labour. And still, the demands didn't end. When war came, and war came often, peasants suffered the most. Lords demanded forced levies of grain, meat, and tools. Armies marched across fields, trampling crops, emptying barns, taking livestock. Raiding soldiers stole food, burned homes, and seized whatever they wanted. Some villages were looted so often that recovery became impossible. Fear of the manor court hung over every decision. This was not a courtroom of fairness. It was an arena of power. A peasant could be fined for gathering fallen wood, for fishing in a forbidden stream, for cutting grass on the wrong day. Complaining about the Lord could lead to brutal punishment. Petitioning for mercy could backfire. Appearing disrespectful could cost a family its land. So peasants learned the delicate art of survival under authority. Speak softly, bow deeply. Offer gifts when possible. Avoid the steward's attention. Hide frustration behind polite silence. But beneath that silence lived fear. Fear of losing land. Fear of losing stored grain. Fear of being assigned extra labour. Fear of the Lord's soldiers. Fear of being noticed. A Lord's visit was never casual. When he arrived, surrounded by retainers, villagers gathered anxiously. Children were hushed, livestock secured, floors swept. The smallest mistake could be costly. A poorly maintained fence, an animal straying, a field insufficiently ploughed. Everything was judged. Everything was recorded. Yet despite the weight of oppression, peasants found ways to endure. They developed quiet strategies, ways to navigate around demands without open rebellion. But those rebellions, those small acts of resistance, belong to the next chapter. For now, the truth is simple. Peasants lived under a system designed to squeeze them dry. And they survived, not because the system was fair, but because they were stronger than anyone expected. For all the hardships peasants faced, famine, plague, labour, and crushing authority, there was one truth the feudal world constantly tried to forget. Peasants were not passive. They were not silent. They were not simple victims drifting wherever fate pushed them. They resisted. Quietly, cleverly, strategically, and sometimes violently. Most resistance didn't look like rebellion. It looked like survival. It began in the smallest choices. Choices that protected families without drawing the Lord's anger. Peasants lived in a world where open defiance meant punishment, fines, or exile. So they learned to move like shadows, bending rules instead of breaking them outright. One of the most common forms of resistance was hiding grain. When harvest time came, peasants stored small amounts of grain in pits hidden beneath barns or buried in the woods. Some hid it in sealed clay pots under floors. Others concealed sacks in thatched roofs. If the Lord's steward believed a family had less than they actually did, the Lord took less. This wasn't greed. It was survival insurance. Grain hidden today could save a family in winter. Another subtle act of defiance was simply working slowly on the Lord's land. No weapons, no fighting, just deliberate slowness. A few extra minutes turning soil, a bit more time sharpening a tool. Tasks done slightly less efficiently. When your body ached constantly, this pace looked natural. And that was the point. Some peasants lied about yields. They reported lower harvest numbers, especially in years when crops were good. Villagers helped each other maintain the deception. If the steward questioned one family, the others supported their story. Staying united meant staying protected. Others escaped to forests, not permanently, but for a few days at a time. They foraged, trapped small animals, or simply hid from extra labour demands. Many villages bordered thick forests, and peasants knew every path, every hiding place, every spot where a family could disappear long enough to recover from exhaustion or avoid a punitive visit from the manor. Still others sought freedom in the growing medieval towns. Towns offered markets, anonymity, and work not tied to a lord. Town laws often stated that if a runaway peasant lived within a town for a year and a day without being claimed, they became legally free. Some never returned. Some left secretly at night with only a sack over their shoulder. Others went with entire families, taking their futures into their own hands. But resistance didn't stop with quiet acts. Sometimes pressure built until silence shattered. Sometimes hardship crossed the line into rage. By the late Middle Ages, entire regions erupted in rebellion. The most famous in England was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Tired of impossible taxes, corrupt officials, and endless war, villagers took up tools, broke into manors, burned documents, and marched toward London. Their message was simple: enough. In the Holy Roman Empire, the German Peasants' War erupted in the 1520s. Thousands of peasants formed armies, demanding fair treatment, reduced taxes, and basic rights. They fought with makeshift weapons, farm tools, anything they could hold. Many died, brutally, but their cry forced Europe to confront the injustice built into its system. These uprisings weren't random explosions of anger. They were the last option after generations of smaller resistance had failed. But the truth is this: rebellions were rare. Quiet resistance was constant. Peasants helped each other avoid punishment. They passed warnings when officials approached. They hid young men during forced levies. They locked barns when soldiers marched by. They shared tools, food, information, strategies. They survived because they stood together when authority pressed down too hard. Peasant resistance wasn't just about defiance. It was a form of dignity. A way of saying, we see the injustice and we refuse to be crushed by it. Their survival strategies weren't dramatic or glorious. They were practical, clever, subtle. They didn't topple kingdoms, but they kept families alive. And across centuries of oppression, those small acts of resistance became a quiet, enduring rebellion. One that shaped the course of medieval history far more than kings ever admitted. If famine tested their stomachs, and plague tested their bodies, then the crushing demands of lords tested their spirits. But even under all that pressure, peasants had something powerful, something that made survival possible when everything else seemed determined to take it away. They had each other. In a world that offered no safety nets, no government support, no hospitals, no insurance, and no mercy from the upper classes, community was not optional. It was survival. It was strategy. It was the invisible shield that kept villages alive through the darkest winters, the harshest famines, and the deadliest illnesses. Walk through a medieval village and you'll see it immediately. Nothing is done alone. Nothing is survived alone. Start with farming, the core of daily life. Fields stretched across open strips of land, shared by dozens of families. They ploughed together, sowed together, harvested together. When one man's plough broke, someone else lent theirs. When a widow struggled to tend her field, neighbours stepped in. If a storm gathered on the horizon, entire villages rushed into the fields to save crops before the rain hit. Shared work meant shared survival. Alone, a family could fail. Together, a village endured. Then there were shared resources, the backbone of communal resilience. Shared ovens baked bread for multiple homes at once. Shared granaries held emergency grain for harsh seasons. Shared livestock grazed in common pastures. Shared mills ground flour for the entire settlement. Even water sources were communal. Women gathered at the village well, not just to fill buckets, but to exchange news, warnings, tips about herbs, advice on raising children, and stories meant to soften the edges of another hard day. Every village also had its network of mutual care. When someone fell ill, neighbours brought broth, herbs, clean straw. When a child was born, women from nearby cottages helped the mother recover. When a man died, the whole village dug the grave, baked bread for the family, and supported the widow through the first impossible weeks of grief. Children were raised by everyone. Grandparents watched the little ones while their parents worked the fields. Older kids taught the younger how to gather mushrooms, where the safest riverbanks were, how to recognize edible plants. Communities became living classrooms, passing down knowledge too valuable to risk losing. And when tragedy struck, as it often did, villages grieved together. They held wakes in small cottages filled with candlelight and murmured prayers. They sang songs meant to comfort the living. They told stories of ancestors who had endured worse. Collective mourning kept despair from swallowing families whole. But community wasn't just about emotional support. It was tactical, practical, smart. During famine, food was rationed collectively. During plague, villages warned each other when sickness approached. During war, neighbours hid valuables together in the forest or buried grain under hard-packed earth. During raids, families fled in groups, so no one travelled unprotected. And during good seasons, rare as they were, the village celebrated as one. Festivals, feasts, dances on the green. Not because life was easy, but because joy felt sweeter when shared by those who had earned it through struggle. Community also created resilience through skill sharing. Some peasants knew how to build carts, some knew how to treat fevers, some knew which mushrooms were safe and which were deadly. Some carved tools from wood, some brewed ale, some knitted wool garments thick enough to outlast winter. No single household could do everything, but the village could do anything. This wasn't accidental. It was a culture built intentionally over centuries, shaped by necessity. When the world outside was unpredictable, the people inside leaned harder on one another. Even conflict within the village was managed through woven ties, gossip, mediation, elders stepping in to calm disputes. A fractured village was a doomed one, and everyone knew it. Community is the quiet hero of medieval life. It saved more lives than medicine, fed more families than harvests could promise, carried more burdens than any lord ever would. In a world where survival was always uncertain, peasants learned the most important truth of all: no one endures alone. And the reason the peasant class survived for centuries, through plague, famine, war, and oppression, is simple. They held each other up when the world tried to pull them down. For medieval peasants, survival wasn't only about food, shelter, or escaping disease. It was also about holding their minds together in a world that felt unpredictable, dangerous, and often unbearably cruel. Their physical strength kept them alive, but their faith, their rituals, their stories, and their superstitions kept them human. If you want to understand the medieval mind, imagine living with constant uncertainty. You don't know why illness strikes one home and not another. You don't know why storms destroy your field while your neighbour's remains untouched. You don't know why babies survive one winter and not the next. You don't know why your lord demands more, even when the land offers less. In a world without explanations, people turned to the only anchors they had: faith and belief. The village church stood at the centre of life, literally and spiritually. Its bell marked time. Its priest interpreted the world. Its rituals guided peasants from birth to death. Walking into a medieval church felt like stepping into a rare place of stability. The stone walls smelled of incense. Candles flickered. Wooden pews creaked under tired bodies. Every Sunday, peasants gathered not just to worship, but to breathe, to be reminded that life had meaning, that suffering wasn't random, that someone, God, saints, angels, was watching over them, even if from a distance. But faith alone wasn't enough. So superstition filled the cracks between hope and fear. Medieval peasants believed the world was alive with signs. A crow circling overhead meant bad news. A sudden chill meant a spirit passing by. A strange dream warned of illness. A halo around the moon predicted dangerous weather. They tied bundles of herbs above the doorway to keep sickness out. Placed iron objects by windows to ward off evil spirits. Wore charms carved from bone, wood, or metal, each one carrying a whispered blessing. Mothers pinned tiny religious tokens to children's clothing, believing they protected them from harm. Every belief, every ritual had meaning, even if that meaning came from fear. Seasonal festivals brought colour into the grey weight of survival. Feasts for midsummer, harvest celebrations, winter traditions, all were designed to remind peasants that life wasn't only toil. These gatherings were loud, chaotic, joyful. People sang until their voices cracked, danced on muddy greens, lit bonfires so bright they pushed back the darkness for miles. Even when there wasn't enough food, they shared what they had. Festivals reconnected people with their own humanity, breaking the monotony of hardship with bursts of laughter and warmth. And then there were stories. Stories saved lives in ways nothing else could. Around the hearth, peasants told tales of saints who protected villages, spirits who guarded forests, heroes who defeated giants, wise old women who spoke to animals. Some stories warned children of danger. Don't wander too far into the woods. Don't trust strangers. Don't go near rivers alone. Others simply gave comfort. Storytelling was therapy before the concept existed. It helped peasants release fear, connect through shared struggles, and make sense of things the world refused to explain. Fear of divine punishment coexisted with hope for divine protection. When plague struck, peasants prayed desperately, lit candles for saints associated with healing, carried icons on cords around their necks. When fields failed, they asked for rain or sun in equal measure. When children fell sick, parents whispered prayers while applying herbs. Faith and superstition intertwined like two roots of the same tree. For peasants, mental survival meant believing that the world wasn't random. Their suffering had purpose. Their lives mattered within a larger story. Whether through prayer, charms, rituals, or tales, peasants found ways to soothe their fear and hold on to hope, even when everything around them seemed designed to take it away. In a world without comfort, they created their own. In a world without certainty, they invented meaning. And in a world where nearly everything was beyond their control, belief became the one thing they could shape. A shield for the mind when the body was tired of fighting. This chapter reveals something powerful. Even in the harshest centuries of European history, peasants didn't just survive through strength, they survived through spirit. If you step back and look at the sweep of medieval history, the wars, the dynasties, the plagues, the famines, the rise and fall of kingdoms, you'll notice something striking. Kings died, lords died, castles crumbled, Borders shifted, empires collapsed, but the peasants remained. Generation after generation, century after century, they endured. Their endurance wasn't loud or glamorous. It wasn't written into chronicles by court scribes or celebrated in songs. It was quiet, steady, and unbreakable. A kind of strength that didn't need recognition because it was woven into every breath they took. To understand the endurance of the peasant class, imagine a world where nearly everything works against you. Your stomach, often half-fed. Your home, fragile against storms and time. Your land, never truly your own. Your future, uncertain by design. And yet, peasants lived. They married. They raised children. They planted fields year after year, even knowing one storm could undo everything. They rebuilt after raids, replanted after droughts, stood back up after burying loved ones. Their endurance was not passive. It was active. It was work. It was will. They survived disasters that would have shattered wealthier, more comfortable lives. Lords and kings had the luxury of expecting stability. Peasants never did. And that is precisely why they endured, because they were prepared for hardship in ways the upper classes couldn't fathom. Think of the forces that tested them. Plagues wiped out entire generations, yet peasants rebuilt families and repopulated villages faster than history could erase them. Famines hollowed bodies, but not spirits. They learned, adapted, shared, rationed, and survived long enough to greet the next harvest. War ravaged their lands, but they returned to the fields as soon as the smoke cleared, pushing seeds into soil still blackened by fire. Lords and taxes squeezed them dry, yet peasants found ways to bend rules, hide grain, and quietly resist without losing their lives. Their endurance came from strategies honed over centuries, the way communities shared tools, the way families pooled food, the way villages united when danger approached, the way knowledge passed from mother to daughter, father to son. This cultural memory, this inherited instinct, became a survival engine stronger than any weapon a lord could wield. They developed tools and techniques still used today: better ploughs, crop rotation systems, food preservation methods, herbal remedies, ways of reading the weather, ways of understanding soil. Peasants shaped the future without ever being credited for it. Despite all the suffering, peasants preserved culture as well. Songs sung in smoky cottages, legends whispered around the hearth, seasonal rituals marking harvests and winters, crafts passed down through hands roughened by labour. While nobles were busy fighting for power, peasants were building the world that power depended on. They kept villages functioning, fields alive, livestock breeding, and traditions breathing through every crisis. Their endurance wasn't just physical, it was emotional, communal, spiritual. They carried grief without letting it break them. They carried fear without letting it paralyze them. They carried hope even when the world gave them little reason to. And here's the final irony. The higher classes believed peasants were disposable, replaceable workers at the bottom of society. But when kingdoms fell, when lords were overthrown, when plagues erased entire noble families, it was the peasants who rebuilt the world. It was the peasants who continued to plant, raise children, feed communities, and restore life after every catastrophe. They didn't just endure history, they carried it. Their story is not one of weakness, but of relentless resilience. Not one of submission, but of quiet strength. Not one of despair, but of survival rooted in instinct, intelligence, and unity. So when we look back at medieval Europe, the truth is clear. The great kingdoms were built on the backs of people who refused to break. People who held on to each other when everything else fell apart. People whose endurance shaped the future far more than the victories of any king. This is the legacy of the peasant class. Not nobility, not glory, but something far more enduring. The courage to survive when the world gave them every reason not to. So now you've walked beside them. Not the kings, not the knights, not the names carved into marble or written in gold, but the people who lived in the mud, the smoke, the hunger, and the hope of everyday life. You've seen the world from the bottom of the pyramid, where survival wasn't guaranteed, where every day began with a question mark, and where strength didn't come from swords or titles, but from endurance woven into the soul. You felt the weight they carried, the fear of plagues that moved like shadows, the ache of famine stretching over seasons, the pressure of lords who demanded more than the land could give. And yet, through all of it, peasants didn't disappear. They held on, they rebuilt, they found ways to laugh, sing, gather, believe, even when the world seemed determined to break them. Their victories weren't won on battlefields. They were won in fields of grain, in crowded cottages, in whispered advice passed at the well, in shared bread during lean winters, in the quiet courage to face another day of uncertainty. Kings ruled for a lifetime. Peasants endured for generations. Their resilience shaped the very foundations of Europe, its food systems, its communities, its culture, its survival. Everything grand that history remembers began with hands that were cracked, calloused, and rarely thanked. So, when you think of medieval Europe, don't picture just the castles and the crowns. Picture the villagers at dawn, standing in wet fields, pushing seeds into cold earth with the stubborn belief that life would continue. Because through all the darkness, they made sure it did. These were not just peasants. They were the survivors who built the world.